I opened my eyes and squinted. The light was so bright, and for a moment I almost forgot where I was. That moment didn't last for long, though, because almost immediately I felt them. It was as if someone had come along and attached 2 coconuts to my chest. Was this what it felt like to have big breasts? I'd done it. I'd really done it. I was now the proud and slightly in pain owner of a 34 double D pair of breasts. I tried to sit upright against the back of the hospital bed, but it hurt. The surgeon had warned me that I'd feel tender for the first week or so, but I hadn't expected it to be this painful. How would I even get out of bed? A nurse passed by and saw me struggling. She propped me up against the bed and told me I needed to rest. Then she smiled reassuringly at me and told me that I looked great. Did I? I wondered. Or had this all been a mistake? I allowed myself to get lost in my thoughts for a bit, thinking back to all those moments in high school where I'd allowed my insecurities to get the better of me. It's not like I was ugly or anything, but had I been the most flat-chested girl in school? Yes, I had been, and it had bothered me a lot. I remember this one time when Savannah, the most popular girl in school, had invited us all to her sweet 16th pool party. I'd been so terrified of everyone seeing how non-existent my chest was that I'd actually stuffed my baby brother's Play-Doh inside my bikini top. It had been the closest thing I could find that might have been similar in texture to breasts, and when I looked in the mirror nervously before the party, I thought they looked pretty real. Of course, I hadn't anticipated that Drake would come up behind me and push me into the pool, my Play-Doh fake breasts falling out of my bikini top and landing with a plop on the surface of the pool. I remember the horror and shame I felt as they sunk to the bottom, and that was pretty much the turning point for me. Never lived it down. From that day on, I was constantly teased about it, even my so-called friends who still bought me Play-Doh every time it was my birthday. And of course, Savannah's voice still echoed inside my head. You know, Polly, if you're that desperate for bigger breasts, why not just get surgery? Like, if I was as flat as a pancake like you are, I'd defo get surgery. And so that was why I found myself lying on this bed in the cosmetic surgery ward, staring down at my new breast implants. I told myself it wasn't because of Savannah, and that it wasn't because of the pool incident. It was because I was an independent young woman, and I could do whatever I wanted. If I wanted bigger breasts to make me feel secure, then so what? And I paid for them myself. Okay, that last part is a bit of a lie. You see, when I went off to college, my parents gave me an allowance for the whole year. My parents aren't that well off, so I knew I had to budget carefully. Well, I'm sure you can guess what I did. I got to college, located the nearest cosmetic surgeon, and scheduled an appointment. I was supposed to bring someone along with me so that they could drive me home, but there was no one I felt comfortable enough telling. I mean, of course, people would notice soon. It's not like I could hide them from anyone. They were huge. I'm pretty petite, so they stood out a lot. That first week, I wore baggy sweaters to hide them. They were a bit bruised from the surgery, so I didn't want anyone else to see until they were fully healed. I was staying in a dorm with 2 other freshman girls, and so there was no way they wouldn't notice. They squealed when I showed them, and one of them said, "Oh, girl, the guys are gonna be all over you." And they were. After they'd healed, I felt confident enough to wear low-cut tops for the first time in my life. No longer did I need to hide my flat chest. I felt feminine, and maybe now I'd finally get a boyfriend. No guys had been interested in me in high school, and I convinced myself that it was because I'd had no breasts. Well, hi boys, look at me now. And they did look. They looked a lot. I was still shy, so whenever I caught someone staring at them, I blushed. Eventually, though, I started to enjoy the attention I was getting. It made me feel like I mattered, and that I was attractive. Pretty soon after, I met a guy called George at a party, and he asked me if I'd like to go out with him sometime. I was so excited that I said yes, and then quickly ran off to find my friends to tell them. They hugged me and we did a celebratory dance. Then I realized that it was kind of rude of me to run off like that, so I headed back to the room where George was. As I entered the room, I couldn't see him. Then I spotted him. He was standing with a group of guys and they were all laughing. As I got closer, I realized what they were laughing at. He was holding 2 balloons in front of his chest, and even though the music was loud, I could still hear what he was saying. "Hi guys, I'm Polly. Do you like my fake breasts? Look at me, look at me." I was so humiliated. He'd literally just asked me out on a date, and yet there he was mocking me in front of everyone. He was no different from the boys I'd gone to high school with. I ran out of there in tears and didn't stop running until I was back in my room. How had he even known they were fake? And why did he think it was okay to laugh at me like that behind my back? I suddenly felt so lonely. All I wanted was to go home to my parents, tell them what I'd done and hope that they'd forgive me, but I couldn't. They'd be so angry at me and they'd probably never want to speak to me again. The worst part was that I had to see George every day as we were in the same class. He didn't even have the guts to come and apologize to me. I knew someone must have seen me crying and running out because he didn't speak to me ever again and never asked me why I wasn't interested in that date with him. It was because of him that I started thinking, had I made a mistake? Why couldn't I win? I was teased for being flat-chested, and then I was teased for having implants. Would the suffering ever end? I kind of fell into a bit of a depressive slump after that, and I should probably have mentioned earlier how much I loved ballet. I had been taking classes ever since I was a little girl, but now, since having my implants, it was not the same anymore. That first class after the surgery was really tough. I didn't feel as light on my feet anymore, and the more I practiced, the more pain I felt. Every time I did a pirouette, I would get a sharp pain in my back. My ballet teacher could see that I was in pain and said that maybe the implants were too big for me. After all, I was very petite. The one thing I thought would change my life for the better was actually destroying it. Boys thought I was shallow, I was in pain, and even my ballet teacher was treating me differently. And to top it all off, I was seriously running out of cash. I'd spent 90% of my allowance for the year on the surgery, and I barely had enough left to pay for food. There was nothing else for it. I'd have to get a job. I applied to a few bookshops, but none of them hired me. It got into my head that it was because of my implants. They were judging me and assuming I was some bimbo. Finally, I decided to apply to a diner. I saw they had an ad out front, and when I went in to ask about it, they hired me on the spot. In fact, they pretty much hired my breasts on the spot, because that was the only place the manager was looking. I swear he didn't make eye contact with me once. I felt sick at the thought of working for such a man, but also I needed the money desperately. My life became a monotonous routine of study, work, sleep, and I was in so much pain from the implants that I ended up having to see a chiropractor to try and help ease the back pain I was getting. It was a never-ending cycle, and every spare dollar I had went towards finding a more comfortable bra to support my implants or on pain medication. Christmas was coming, and that meant I would have to see my parents. There was no way I could hide this from them, and they were already pretty angry at me as my grades weren't as good as they used to be. I could hardly tell them that I spent every waking hour working instead of studying because I'd spent all their money on trying to boost my confidence. It was seriously a disaster! Just before Christmas, I was working on one of my last shifts at the diner for the year. I felt relieved to get out of there. I was sick of my manager staring at my chest, and that shift was no different. I have never been so upset in all my life. All those fears I'd had about people perceiving me as shallow and attention-seeking were coming to the surface, especially that I was never used to it before the surgery. As I walked home in the snow, tears running down my cheeks, I made the decision to tell my parents and ask them to help me to get these stupid implants removed. Getting breast implants was the worst thing I'd ever done in my life. I couldn't live like this anymore. Well, my parents were, of course, furious, but more than that, they were upset. Upset that I'd been such an insecure teenager, and upset that I'd betrayed their trust like this. That Christmas vacation, they could see how much pain and humiliation my implants brought me, and without me even asking them, they offered to pay for me to get them removed. I didn't even have to think about it. I knew it was the right decision, and I was so unbelievably grateful that my parents supported me, even after how I'd betrayed them. I can't explain the lightness I felt when they were removed, not just physically, but also mentally. I felt like a weight had been taken off of me. I could breathe again and practice ballet, and I even got a job in the library so that I could pay my parents back for the removal surgery. This time, no one looked at my chest. In fact, no one even cared. I realized that my insecurity about the size of my breasts was self-inflicted, and that true friends couldn't care less about how big or small they were. Getting implants was seriously the biggest mistake I've ever made. But hey, if I hadn't done it, I might not be as happy and comfortable in my own skin as I am today. I guess there's always a lesson to be learned, even if it's a pretty painful one.
Hello, I'm Ava, and some of you might assume that I'm very lucky. Like, the luckiest person alive. Why? Well, this is going to shock you. But I won nearly $200 million in the lottery. That's crazy, right? Well, you know what's crazier? The day that I won that money was the worst day of my life. Yes, you heard me right. The worst day of my life. Because the moment that I won that money, my life became unbearable. You see, I used to live in a neighborhood with my mom, my sister, and my stepdad. I can't say things were perfect, but I used to be happy. Everything changed the day I found out my stepdad had been fired from his job. And, soon enough, we started getting last warnings on our bills, and even warning letters from our landlord. On the third rent due notice, we got evicted and kicked out of our own house. I wanted to cry that day, but I tried to stay strong for my family. I told them that I might have just enough money that we could survive on, and that they shouldn't worry. I then took out all the money I saved in my bank account and realized that it could probably buy us an old trailer that we could live in, and that's exactly what happened. My stepdad thanked me and went off to look for a suitable trailer that we could all fit in, and in a few hours, we were living in a trailer park near an old dump. And just like that, the tuition money that I saved for months for college all disappeared overnight, forcing me to start from square one. It felt horrible, and it seemed like I was never going to get a chance to go to college. I felt tears starting to run down my cheeks, but I didn't want any of my family members to see that I was crying, so I wiped them away quickly. I excused myself and went out of the trailer for a walk. It felt like the more I walked, the more I thought about my problems. There was just no escape from it. As I was wandering the streets, I ran into a gas station nearby. I wanted to get something to drink from the store, and I saw a big sign that said, "A chance to win $200 million. I laughed sarcastically. "Yeah, sure," I whispered to myself. Behind me stood an old lady who heard me. She said, "You never know, dear. Life is all about luck. You should get one." I didn't really believe her, but I was desperate. "2 tickets, please," I told the cashier. He handed them over, and I took one card, then gave the other to the old lady as a nice gesture. We left the store together, and she gave me her card and said that she doesn't have a TV and wouldn't be able to know if she won. So, she then gave me her address and said that if she had won anything, I can come over to her house and let her know. As I walked back home, my thoughts went back and forth in my head about what would happen if I actually won any type of money. It was a little fantasy, something to think about, just to ease my mind away from my troubles. When I made it home and opened the door, my sister, mom, and stepdad were all fighting. It looked like they had gotten themselves into another argument about money, but I was too tired to bother getting involved, and I simply went to bed. Days had passed, and I had almost forgotten about the lottery tickets, until one evening, I was reminded to check my numbers when my stepdad had the TV. It was a local news channel that talked about how the lottery money was yet to be claimed. They showed the numbers on the screen, and I pulled out my ticket. I wasn't very surprised that the numbers didn't match, and I crumbled it up, ready to move on, until I remembered the old lady's ticket, and pulled that out as well. When I went over the numbers, then went over them again, I felt like the room started to spin. The numbers matched perfectly. I quickly reached back into my pocket and fished out the paper that the lady wrote her address on. I wanted to rush over and tell her the news, but when I held the paper in my hand, I froze. $200 million. The thought kept running through my head. I looked around the trailer and thought even more about everything we could do with that money. I bought the ticket, and my family was really struggling. I knew that we could use the money more than she could, so I decided not to tell her. I mean, she was an old lady. What would she do with it anyway? Instead, I leaped up from the chair and called my family over. When I told them the news, none of them believed me, but I just smiled. We looked back toward the TV and checked the numbers again. When it was confirmed, we all jumped and shouted with joy. It was an unbelievable feeling. Everyone started talking about what they wanted to do, but one thing we could all agree on was getting out of that trailer. We went and cashed in the ticket. There was a big news conference filled with cameras, and my mom was made up to look her best. Our first purchase was a big house in the best part of town. I shared the money with my mom, sister, and stepdad, and they were quick to splurge. My mom bought clothes from only the most expensive stores and boutiques, while my sister bought herself the car of her dreams. And even my stepdad started spending money on unnecessary things. Don't get me wrong, I didn't mind the initial thrill, but after a while, things started to get out of hand. It seemed like the more money that was spent, the more things everyone wanted. Our once overly big house was being filled with stuff that was paid for, used once, and never touched again. I was happy that everyone was enjoying themselves after struggling so much, but we all started to drift apart. It was like we were at a crossroads, each headed in our own direction. And while everyone else seemed happy to walk off toward their own idea of luxury, I felt miserable. Nothing I seemed to buy made me feel better. And the more I tried to get our family to spend time together, the more they moved apart. Whenever we were in the same room with each other, an argument would break out. In the end, I barely saw any of them anymore. I just wanted to feel the connection that we once had. That's when I got the biggest shock of my life. A couple of months passed, and my biological father showed up to the house. It had been so long that I barely recognized him. He seemed happy to see me, and talked about how he missed being a family. He was really over the top, and started talking about how he wanted to be in my life again. I was so angry when I saw his face. I remembered the day he walked away from us, leaving me, my sister, and our mom to struggle alone because, and I quote, "I didn't sign up for this. I never even wanted kids." I told him if he didn't want us then, he's not going to be in my life now, and slammed the door on his stunned face. For the rest of the day, I felt an emptiness fill me. It wasn't just from seeing my biological father, but from the money and what it turned everybody into. A once close family wasn't even talking to each other anymore. My sister and I were best friends, but now I only see her when she comes by to pick up her stuff or ask for more money. My stepdad isn't the same hard worker that he used to be either. Now he spends his time wasting away on the couch, isolating himself from everything but the television. And even though my mother was never the kindest or the most caring person, now she's even worse. She doesn't even try to hide the fact that she's only interested in the family for as long as it can benefit her. She spent more money than everyone else, and she's become more spoiled. Sadly, I am not any better. I always thought that I wanted to be better than my mom, but when the money came, I realized that I was similar. I started becoming more materialistic. I began buying things I didn't need, and I started caring about what people think about me. The worst part of all was that I even gave up on my education. When I really thought about it, it made me sick. Finally, it hit me. The money wasn't even mine in the first place. After all this time, I remembered the old lady and how the ticket was hers, how she was the reason that I bought the ticket after all. Feeling that my mind was made up, I decided to find her. I remembered her address and got dressed to go see her. When I made it to her house, it was small and looked a little worn out, but it was also peaceful. I knocked on the door, and there she was. I explained to her what happened with the tickets that I bought and was ready to apologize, but, to my surprise, she told me that she didn't remember. She saw the confusion on my face and politely invited me inside. And there, I saw her family. She introduced me to her children. She had 2 sons and a daughter, and they introduced me to their kids. They all welcomed me with a smile, a complete stranger, and they didn't look put off. I explained to them how I met their mom, and they seemed to all realize what happened. She had Alzheimer's, and it was starting to reach the late stages. Her kids came home to help their mom and brought their families so that she could feel comfortable since their father had passed a long time ago. I came to thank her and share the money with her, but without me even offering them any money, they treated me kindly and invited me to dinner. I was hesitant, but I missed having family dinners, so I decided to stay. It was one of the best nights I've had in a very long time. We laughed, shared stories, and played games together. The family didn't have much, but they were happy. It reminded me of what I used to have. So, after the sun started to go down and I started to leave, I turned and told her and her kids my plan to give them a majority share of the money. I wrote each one of them a check and handed them out. They were shocked, then overjoyed. They all laughed and smiled. I thanked the lady one more time and walked away. On my way home, I called up my family and told them to meet me. By the time I arrived, they were there. I walked in and saw them arguing again. At that point, I didn't want to waste any more time. I calmed them down and jumped straight into what I did. Their reaction went from shocked to screaming to anger, but I didn't back down. I explained that the money was ruining us, how it was like we weren't even a family anymore. There was just enough for each of us to live comfortably, and I understood if they were angry with me. After that, I walked away. It took a couple of days, but eventually, my family seemed to realize the same thing I did. My sister was the first to come around, then my stepdad. My mom, on the other hand, rarely ever spoke to me again. Her and my stepdad got divorced, and she moved into her own place. Though I was disappointed, I kind of figured she would feel that way. After a while, it seemed like I was getting my family back. Everyone had grown accustomed to going their own way, but now we spent more time as a family. I started college like I always wanted, and spent my time studying. I still look back with regret about the day that I won the lottery and how it turned my family against each other, but now I look at the good it was